The first sound that reached the old ranch road that November morning was not a horse. It was stone. A dull scrape. Another. Then another. Judge Harlan McBride pulled his horse to a stop and listened. Someone was dragging something impossibly heavy across frozen ground. He followed the sound through the pale grass until he saw her. A lone woman leaned into a rope harness wrapped across her shoulders. Behind her, a rough wooden sled carried flat gray river stones stacked almost as high as her waist. Her boots slipped. The sled refused to move. She tightened the rope, lowered her head, and pulled again. The stones finally slid forward a few inches. The judge did not call out. He simply watched. No one hauled rocks across the Nebraska prairie unless they had completely lost hope, or discovered something nobody else had. If stories like this remind you that ordinary people once survived impossible winters with nothing but stubborn hands and simple ideas, stay with us. What happened on this lonely homestead changed more than one life before winter finally released its grip. 5 months earlier, none of it existed. Sable McCreary arrived in western Nebraska with 2 daughters, $14, and a folded land paper that still carried her husband's name. The endless prairie stretched farther than she could imagine. No trees, no neighbors close enough to hear a cry. Only wind moving through tall grass beneath a sky that seemed too large for one family. Her husband, Owen, had never seen the land. He had signed the homestead papers before a mining tunnel collapsed in Pennsylvania. By the time the claim became theirs, he was already gone. Many people told Sable to return east. They said Nebraska belonged to stronger people, people born for hard winters, people who understood the prairie. Sable simply folded Owen's papers, placed them inside her coat, and kept walking. The claim waited nearly 3 miles outside Chadron. The cabin looked smaller than she expected, 10 feet wide, 14 feet long. Green boards had already twisted as they dried beneath the prairie sun. Thin cracks separated almost every plank. Sunlight slipped through them as though the walls had forgotten how to stay together. Inside stood one cast-iron stove, one narrow sleeping shelf, one tiny south window. The floor was bare earth. Delia quietly looked around the room. She was only 9, but she had already learned that children sometimes needed to hide their questions. June was 6. She stared at the little cabin before looking up at her mother. "Are we really living here?" Sable forced a small smile. "We are." The girls unpacked blankets while Sable inspected everything. The stove still worked. That was good. The chimney leaked slightly. That was not. Outside, a short pile of cottonwood waited beside the wall. Barely enough for early autumn. Nowhere near enough for a Nebraska winter. There was no barn, no horse, no wagon, no tools worth mentioning. Only silence stretching across open country. That first night, the wind found every crack in the cabin. It whispered through the walls without stopping. The stove burned steadily, yet cold air continued drifting across the floor. Sable barely slept. She listened, counted every sound, measured every weakness the cabin revealed. 4 mornings later, a wagon stopped outside. The visitor climbed down wearing polished boots, untouched by mud. Edgar Pruitt smiled before reaching the porch. "Mrs. McCreary." His voice sounded pleasant. Too pleasant. "I heard about your husband." Sable nodded once. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited. His eyes examined every corner. The stove, the woodpile, the walls, the girls sitting quietly together. He noticed everything. Finally, he spoke. "This claim will be difficult for someone in your position." He rested one hand on the table. "I can save you unnecessary suffering." He offered $40 for the land, enough money to leave Nebraska, enough money to disappear quietly before winter arrived. Sable looked at the folded claim papers lying beside the lamp. She remembered Owen tracing the advertisement with one rough finger across their kitchen table. 160 acres, a new beginning, fresh air instead of coal dust. He had believed every printed word. She slowly pushed the offer back toward Edgar. "No." His smile barely changed. "I'll return." He walked outside. Before climbing into his wagon, he looked toward the northern horizon. "When January comes," he said softly, "this prairie doesn't forgive mistakes." Then he left. Dust settled behind his wheels. The cabin became silent again. 3 days later, another visitor arrived. This one carried no polished boots, no expensive coat. Ruth Calloway climbed down from her plain wagon with the steady movements of someone who had survived too many winters to waste energy. She accepted a cup of coffee, looked around the cabin once, then spoke without decoration. "I buried 2 neighbors after the winter of '85. Sable remained still. They both believed they had enough firewood. Ruth pointed toward the small pile outside. "You don't?" She explained the numbers. At least 4 cords. Better 5. More if the winter stayed cruel. Sable had less than half of what she truly needed. Even if she worked every day until snow arrived, she could never gather enough without horses. The arithmetic was simple. The outcome was not. Ruth stood to leave. At the doorway, she paused. "Pruitt already visited." Sable nodded. "He'll come back." The older woman pulled on her gloves. "And each visit will become harder to refuse." The wagon disappeared into the open prairie. Sable remained standing alone beside the cabin. The wind moved through dry grass. She looked toward the distant river cutting across the land. Something caught the afternoon light there. Flat gray stone. She watched it for only a moment before turning back toward the cabin. She did not know it yet, but that quiet glance toward the river would become the first step in a fight against the cold that nobody around Chadron believed could be won. The next morning began before sunrise. The prairie still rested beneath a layer of silver frost. Each step across the frozen ground made a quiet crunch that carried through the empty land. Sable wrapped an old rope around her shoulders and started walking toward the river. She had no clear plan. Only a question she could not stop thinking about. Why had that single stone beneath the stove stayed warm longer than everything around it? The river wound through low banks nearly 3 miles away. Cold water slipped quietly around smooth gray slate that had rested there for longer than anyone could remember. She knelt beside the bank and picked up one flat piece. It looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested it could help a family survive winter. Still, she carried it home. Then another. Then another. By sunset, 3 heavy stones rested beside the stove. That evening she kept the fire small, not roaring, not wasteful, only steady. Every hour she reached down and touched the slate. Slowly the cold surface changed. It gathered warmth without becoming hot. After the girls fell asleep, she stayed awake. The fire finally died. The stove cooled. The room slowly filled with cold air. She waited another hour, then placed her hand on the nearest stone. It still carried warmth. Not much, but enough to notice. She touched the floor. Cold. She touched the stove. Cold. She returned her hand to the slate. Still warm. Sable did not smile. She simply sat there until daylight. Something inside that stone refused to let go of its heat. The following morning, she returned to the river with a rough wooden sled she built from leftover boards. The empty sled already felt heavy. The loaded one fought every step home. The rope cut into her shoulders. Her gloves became wet. Her hands shook before noon. Still, she kept pulling. Neighbors began noticing. One wagon slowed beside the road. 2 men watched her without offering help. What is she doing? No idea. Looks like she's hauling her own grave. They laughed softly before driving away. Sable never answered. She kept pulling. By the end of the week, flat stacks of river slate lined the outside wall of the cabin. Then she carried them inside. She leaned the first stones carefully against the north wall. The coldest wall, the wall facing the winter winds. The stack reached only to her knees before everything collapsed. The stones scattered across the dirt floor. Delia rushed forward. "Are you hurt?" Sable slowly picked herself up. "No." She brushed the dirt from her sleeves, then started again. The second attempt lasted 4 days before another section slipped apart. This time, one stone narrowly missed June's foot. Sable immediately pulled the entire wall apart herself. If it could fall once, it could fall again. She refused to risk the girls. Failure did not send her back to the river. It sent her back to learning. She studied every stone, their shapes, their weight, how each piece balanced against another. Little by little, the wall began standing longer. One chilly afternoon, Ruth Calloway returned. She stood quietly inside the doorway. Her eyes traveled across the growing stone wall. "You've filled your house with rocks. It stays warmer." Ruth stepped closer. She pressed one weathered hand against the slate, then against the wooden wall beside it. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ruth looked back. "If this fails, I know. If winter catches you before it's finished, I know." Ruth nodded once. She climbed into her wagon and left without another word. Sable watched her disappear. She understood why Ruth doubted her. Everyone measured winter by firewood. Nobody measured it by stone. A week later, another visitor appeared. Judge Harlan McBride. He removed his gloves before stepping inside. Unlike Pruitt, he looked at the people before studying the cabin. The girls sat reading beside the stove. Their mother stood beside another unfinished section of stone. The judge walked slowly around the room. He examined the loose walls, the chimney, the stacked slate, then faced Sable. "A petition has been filed." She already knew who filed it. "Pruitt?" The judge nodded. "He claims this cabin is unsafe for children." Silence settled between them. "The hearing is in December." Sable waited. "If the court believes your daughters cannot safely remain here—" He stopped. His next words came carefully. "They may be placed somewhere else." Neither girl moved. Delia quietly lowered her book. June looked toward her mother. Sable's fingers tightened around the edge of one stone until her knuckles turned white. "I understand." The judge looked around once more. "I've seen many people prepare for winter." His eyes rested on the stone wall. "I've never seen this." Then he left. The sound of his horse faded across the prairie. Inside the cabin, nobody spoke. That evening, Sable worked until her shoulders refused another lift. She rebuilt the wall again. This time, every stone overlapped the one beneath it. Each gap filled with clay and stove ash. Each layer leaned slightly toward the wooden boards instead of away from them. Slowly, the wall stopped behaving like a pile of rocks. It became part of the cabin itself. One cold morning, while gathering more slate beside the river, she noticed an older man standing above the bank. His clothes carried years of dust. His hands looked as rough as old tree bark. He watched her choose another piece of slate, then quietly said, "You're picking the wrong stones." Sable looked up. "They hold heat." "Some do." He climbed down the bank and lifted one pale gray slab she had ignored. It looked lighter. Instead, it felt much heavier. He struck it gently against another stone. A sharp, ringing sound filled the quiet riverbank. Then he picked one of her choices. The second stone answered with only a dull thud. "The ring tells you everything." She looked at him carefully. "You build with stone?" "I've spent 40 years listening to it." He reached for another piece. "Show me your cabin." For the first time since arriving in Nebraska, Sable believed someone else might finally understand what she was trying to build. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'm really curious to know." The old man introduced himself only after they reached the cabin. "Cornelius Voss." His voice stayed calm. No wasted words. No empty praise. He slowly walked around the inside of the little cabin while Sable waited. His fingertips rested on the stone wall. He tapped several pieces with his knuckles. Then he crouched beside the stove. Finally, he stood again. "The idea is right." Sable released a quiet breath she had been holding. "But the wall is still fighting itself." He pointed toward the lower rows. "These stones carry too much weight straight down." He removed one piece, then another. Within minutes, part of her carefully built wall lay on the floor again. Delia looked disappointed. Sable simply watched. Cornelius picked up another stone. "This one belongs here." He turned it sideways, then placed another across the joint instead of directly above it. The weight spreads. Another stone followed, and this keeps everything locked together. By sunset, only a small section had been rebuilt, yet it already looked stronger than everything Sable had managed alone. The old builder returned the next morning, and the morning after that. Sometimes he arrived before daylight, sometimes after feeding his own animals. He never announced himself. He simply started working. Slowly the cabin changed. The north wall became solid. Then the corner around the stove. Every stone touched another, every gap filled with clay mixed carefully with fine ash. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. One evening, Cornelius rested his hand against the finished corner beside the stove. "Feel it." Sable pressed her palm against the slate. Warm. Not surface warm. The warmth reached deep inside the stone. He nodded. "The fire isn't heating the room anymore." She looked at him. "It's charging the wall." Those simple words stayed with her. From that day forward, she changed the way she burned wood. No large fires, no towering flames, only slow coals, hour after hour. The cabin never became hot, but the stones quietly gathered every bit of heat they could. As autumn faded, the nights became colder. Each morning, Sable checked the walls before lighting another fire. The stones still carried a gentle warmth long after the stove had cooled. Not enough to make the room comfortable, enough to keep the cold from rushing in all at once. She knew she was onto something. Word spread quickly across Chadron. People laughed. "The widow is decorating her cabin with rocks. Maybe she'll build herself a castle." Others simply shook their heads. "No family survives a Nebraska winter like that." Edgar Pruitt heard every rumor. His wagon returned before the first heavy snow. He stepped inside and stared at the walls. The smile on his face looked thinner this time. "You've been busy." Sable continued placing another stone. "I have." "You know this changes nothing." She remained silent. "The court doesn't care about rocks." Still no answer. Pruitt slowly walked toward the stove. His eyes measured every improvement, every stack, every careful joint. Then he turned. My offer is $60. No. 70. She looked at him for the first time. No. He sighed. I've watched people fight this prairie for years. His hand rested lightly on the doorway. The prairie always wins. Sable answered quietly. We'll see. Pruitt climbed into his wagon. This time, he did not look back. Days later, Judge McBride arrived again. Snow already covered patches of ground. His face carried a different expression. The hearing is still scheduled. Sable nodded. But Pruitt has filed another complaint. She waited. He now questions whether the stove belongs to you. Her eyes narrowed. The hardware store still holds a small, unpaid note. She understood immediately. Without the stove. Everything ended. No fire, no heated stone, no chance. The judge looked toward the girls. I wanted you to hear it from me first. After he rode away, Sable quietly sat beside the stove. Neither daughter interrupted her. The room stayed silent except for the gentle ticking of hot iron. That night she counted every coin she owned. $14. The stove debt was $18. She was $4 short. She counted again. Nothing changed. The next morning she worked even harder. Another trip to the river. Another load. Another wall. Her shoulders burned beneath the rope. Her hands split open where the old blisters had already healed. She wrapped them with cloth and kept pulling. Near sunset, someone called her name. It was Ruth Calloway. She climbed down from her wagon carrying a small envelope. I heard. Sable looked at the envelope, but did not reach for it. Ruth placed it gently on the sled. There are $4 inside. Sable looked up. I can't promise when. I didn't ask. The older woman folded her gloves. I've buried enough neighbors. The wind pushed loose snow across the prairie. Ruth looked toward the cabin covered with river slate. When I first saw this, she paused. I thought you had stopped thinking. Her eyes rested on the stone wall visible through the doorway. I was wrong. She climbed back into her wagon. Pay the stove. Then she drove away. Sable stood alone beside the sled. The envelope remained exactly where Ruth had left it. She picked it up carefully. Not because of the money, because someone had finally believed. That afternoon, she walked straight into Chadron. She paid the last $4. The hardware owner handed her the receipt. She folded it beside Owen's land papers inside her coat. The stove was finally hers. That evening, the first real blizzard warning spread across western Nebraska. Dark clouds rolled over the northern prairie. The wind changed direction. Birds disappeared. Even the horses in nearby fields turned their backs toward the coming storm. Cornelius stood outside the cabin before leaving for home. He looked across the empty horizon. When this one arrives, he rested one weathered hand against the warm stone wall. We'll find out whether these rocks have truly learned how to remember fire. He climbed onto his horse. Within minutes, blowing snow swallowed him completely. Sable watched until he disappeared. Then she closed the cabin door, fed another small piece of wood into the stove, and placed her hand against the stone wall one more time. It already felt warmer than the fire itself. Outside, the first roar of the Great Plains winter rolled across the darkness toward her little cabin. Night arrived without warning. The last strip of pale sky vanished behind thick clouds. Then the wind struck. Not in gusts, not in waves. It came as one long push that never seemed to stop. Snow raced across the prairie almost sideways. The little cabin groaned. Every board answered with a deep wooden sound. Sable placed another small piece of cottonwood into the stove. Not too much, just enough to keep the bed of glowing coals alive. The flames stayed low, exactly as Cornelius had taught her. The girls sat close together beneath heavy blankets. Neither one complained. They could hear the storm speaking outside. Each blast sounded stronger than the one before. By midnight, snow covered nearly half the south window. The wind found every crack that still remained in the cabin. Thin streams of cold air slipped inside. Months earlier, that cold would have rushed through the room. Tonight, something slowed it. The stone walls quietly released the warmth they had gathered all day. Sable placed her hand against the slate. The heat was still there, steady, patient. The fire no longer carried the whole burden. The walls had begun carrying it too. Hours passed. The temperature outside continued falling. Then another problem arrived. The chimney suddenly gave a deep rumble. Smoke drifted back into the room. Delia looked toward her mother. "The fire!" Sable already understood. The wind had shifted. It was forcing air back down the chimney. Smoke slowly gathered beneath the ceiling. June started coughing. Without wasting a second, Sable wrapped a damp cloth over the girls' faces. "Stay low." She pulled on her coat. The moment she opened the door, the storm slammed against her. Snow covered her face instantly. She could barely breathe. She followed the cabin wall with one hand until she reached the ladder. Each step disappeared beneath drifting snow. She climbed slowly. The wind pulled at her clothes with frightening strength. Finally, her hands found the metal chimney cap. It had twisted sideways. The wind was driving straight into it. Her fingers had almost no feeling left. Still, she gripped the frozen metal. Twisted. Pushed. The cap suddenly dropped back into place. She climbed down as quickly as she could. Inside the cabin, the smoke slowly disappeared. The stove breathed normally again. Sable removed her frozen gloves. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely feed another stick of wood into the fire. Still, the cabin remained warmer than it had any right to be. Outside, the blizzard continued. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, Sable opened the wood box. Only one split log remained. She stared at it, then quietly placed it inside the stove. The flames rose once more. For a short while, she knew exactly what came next. By dawn, there would be no wood left. The final log slowly became glowing coals. Then, glowing coals became soft orange ash. The stove cooled. Silence filled the room. Delia looked toward her mother. "Is the fire gone?" "Yes." No tears, no panic, only one honest answer. The room slowly grew colder. Sable gathered both daughters onto the long stone bench beside the stove. Months earlier, she had stacked those heavy river slates one piece at a time. People laughed. People called her foolish. Now those same stones quietly gave back every hour of warmth they had collected. The girls rested against them. Their blankets stayed warm underneath instead of turning cold against the floor. Sable placed one hand beneath June's blanket. The stones still carried heat. Not much, but enough. She closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them again, pale morning light had begun pushing through the snow-covered window. The storm had weakened. Outside, the prairie had disappeared beneath mountains of drifting snow. The cabin door would not open. Snow buried nearly half the wall. Several hours later, distant voices drifted across the wind. Someone shouted. Another answered. Then came the sound of shovels striking packed snow. Judge Harlan McBride reached the cabin first. Behind him came Ruth Calloway, Cornelius Voss, Thomas Vane. Even two ranchers who had once laughed as Sable dragged stone across the prairie. Together they cleared the doorway. Judge McBride stepped inside expecting the worst. Instead, he stopped completely. The fire had been dead for hours. Frost covered the window. The air remained cold. Yet both girls slept peacefully beneath their blankets. Sable sat beside them with one tired hand resting against the stone wall. Judge McBride slowly removed one glove. He pressed his palm against the slate. His eyes widened. The stone was still warm. Cornelius quietly nodded. It remembered. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ruth looked around the little cabin. "I've lived on this prairie for 7 years." She rested her hand beside the judge's. "I've never seen anything like this." The two ranchers who had mocked Sable outside Chadron stood silently near the doorway. Neither could find a single word. Weeks later, neighbors began hauling river slate to their own homes. Cabins across the prairie slowly changed. Stone walls appeared beside stoves. Stone benches appeared beneath windows. People who once laughed now asked questions. Sable answered every one of them. Freely. She never charged anyone. She simply showed them what she had learned. When Edgar Pruitt returned one final time, he stopped outside the cabin. Children's laughter drifted through the open doorway. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. The stone walls stood strong behind the window. He looked at the cabin for a long moment, then quietly climbed back into his wagon. Without speaking a single word, he turned his horses around and drove away forever. Years later, travelers crossing western Nebraska still spoke about the widow who pulled hundreds of river stones across the prairie with nothing more than a homemade sled and quiet determination. Many remembered the walls. Others remembered the blizzard. But those who knew the full story always remembered something else. While nearly everyone searched for more firewood, one determined woman discovered that sometimes survival begins by protecting the warmth you already have. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves unforgettable American frontier survival stories.